All right. This is OpenStax World History, Volume 2 from 1400. We'll be starting with the first chapter, Chapter 1, Understanding the Past. Now, in addition to starting the first chapter, we're also starting the first unit. Our textbook is divided into 3 units, each unit covering about 5 chapters. Unit 1 is called Connections Across Continents 1500 to 1800. And what's going on in this unit in terms of big picture is really a shift or change in the way in which the world is connected. That is to say that, starting about 1500, the primary center of exchange in the world is a series of trade routes that go from Europe to Asia, also incorporating places like Africa, and also including places like the Indian Ocean. But these are fundamentally trade routes that stretch from east to west across the continents of Africa, Europe, and Asia. Traditionally and historically, we refer to these trade routes as the Silk Roads, and you can go far, far back from the year 1500 and really see the Silk Roads as being the central area of exchange. Now that changes, and an important development for that change is Columbus's voyage in 1492, which some of you may be familiar with. But in 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing on behalf of the Spanish crown, makes his way to the Americas. And that would allow for a new system of exchange to develop, something that the world had never experienced before. This is sometimes referred to as the triangle trade routes from Europe to the Americas to Africa and back to Europe. So a new exchange, right? We sometimes call this the Atlantic world. This is covered in chapter 5. Chapter 5 is called Foundations of the Atlantic. But maybe just as important, but maybe not as well known, perhaps, was the efforts by first countries like Portugal, but other Europeans to sail from Europe around Africa and into the Indian Ocean, allowing for an exchange to develop that in some ways bypasses the Silk Roads and instead allows goods to be sent back and forth across Europe and Asia, but via a maritime route, right? Via the Indian Ocean and going around. It doesn't take very long for explorers to essentially close the loop, and that is to make their way from Asia across the Pacific Ocean and then back to the Americas. So, again, big picture, Unit 1, the sort of shift in exchange from historically the Silk Roads, these land routes, and some sea routes across Asia, now to an exchange network that incorporates the entire globe, that is more focused on the maritime exchange, right? Almost exclusively. And one of the impacts is that, for the historic trade routes of the Silk Roads, these are going to decline in terms of their importance, right? As more goods are facilitated across these oceanic routes across the world, the historic routes here, the Silk Roads, those are going to decline. And so, in this unit and in these chapters, we take a geographic approach. So, we're going to be jumping from in chapter 2 places like East Asia, which includes, China and Japan, areas of the Indian Ocean here, right? We'll be looking at India and the surrounding areas. Chapter 3, we get to go to Africa. Chapter 4, the Islamic world, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. And one of the themes that we will encounter in all of these chapters is there's going to be a point where these outside traders arrive, right? Whether it's the Portuguese or the Spanish or the Dutch or the English, and what type of impact does that have on existing empires and existing cultures, existing social structures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the big picture theme here. Now, getting back to chapter 1, the first chapter of our textbook, this is a chapter that we don't really start covering any history per se. It's more of just an introduction into mainly 2 questions. That is, why do we study world history? And how do we study world history? Section 1, developing a global perspective. So, in this section, we get a little bit for why we study world history. And some of the reasons aren't just specific to world history, but also branch out into just kind of history more broadly. And I would say probably the number one reason given as to why we study history or why we study world history is to learn from the mistakes made in the past. Learn from mistakes made in the past. And there's a really good saying that kind of encapsulates this idea. And you may have heard it before, and that is history repeats itself. There's a little bit better of a saying than that, because you'll get people who object. When someone says, "Look, history repeats itself," it's well, actually, these two areas aren't exactly or identical, and there's some differences here. So, okay, fine, history doesn't repeat itself exactly, and that is to say that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Right? So it's not exactly the same between any two circumstances, but there are many, many, many similarities that we can look back to the past. And the better we understand it, and specifically the better we understand the mistakes that other people made, that helps guide us into the future, right? So history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Now, in terms of world history, right, why we study world history specifically? Well, part of the reason is just because of current circumstances, namely globalization. And globalization, this is, in some sense, how connected the world is. And today we're living in a globalized world that is much more connected than in the past. And in terms of just the trajectory, we're becoming more and more and more connected every day. And so, as people become more and more connected around the world, as geographic barriers, language barriers, class barriers, technological barriers are increasingly overcome, it makes it more relevant to us to understand the history of the entire world rather than living in maybe perhaps an isolated society, right? So the increased globalization around the world. Another reason as to why we might study world history is for a very practical reason, as your textbook calls it, real world skills. And we have a little bit of an illustration here of exactly what those skills are. So, the ability to analytically and creatively think, innovative and original lines of inquiry, confidence, and competence. So, the more that we study world history, the more we're able to develop these real world skills. And these are skills, we might say, helpful in, to be quite frank, getting a job, right? In some sense, we want to study world history to practice our skills, so we can make ourselves more, more competitive in the labor market. So that's another reason as to why we study world history. The last reason is related to global issues, and this is somewhat connected to the first point about learning from mistakes made in the past. And that is some of the global issues that we find today, we can really only solve them with a global approach, right? So these might be issues that go, say, beyond any single country and impact the world, right? If you want to fix something, it'd be really helpful to know how it was broken to. And if these issues are on a scale that understanding how they were broke requires us to really take an approach to history that encapsulates the whole world, then it's especially relevant. Our textbook gives us an image here. This is Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States in the 1930s and 1940s. And she is holding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that would be an example of a global issue. So if you are concerned about something like human rights, and that is not just the rights of people in one specific country, but rights of people all around the world, in order to begin to think about how to solve that problem, we require an investigation into quote unquote how it was broken to begin with. We need a world historical approach. Another example is an issue like climate change, right? Climate change is something that impacts the entire world. And so, if there's any type of effort to resolve that, an understanding of world history is going to be much more helpful than just an understanding of a national history or local history. Section two, primary sources. And I would say in the first chapter, this is probably the most important thing to take away, and that is the difference between a primary and secondary source. Before we get to that difference, though, let's just backtrack slightly and identify what a source is. A source is anything that provides information about the past. How do we know about history? Well, we know about it through sources, anything that can give us information. But when we get these sources, we then divide them into two categories: primary sources and secondary sources. A primary source is a source that comes directly from the time slash place of historical inquiry, right? So, whatever we're interested in learning about, a source is considered primary if it was at the place and at the time that we are trying to figure out more information about, right? It has a direct connection to that particular historical event. So, for example, we talked about Columbus's voyage in the last section. A primary source would be something like the journal that Columbus wrote down during his voyage. So, any sort of documents that were created at the time, diaries, newspapers, journals, anything that was written down by people who were there. Another great example are artifacts. Again, using the same example of Columbus's voyage, something like I don't know, a pair of shoes that one of the sailors was wearing. That would be something that, because it was there, because it has a direct connection, and by unearthing it and analyzing it, we might be able to find out more information from it. So again, anything that has a direct connection or comes from the time and place is considered primary. A secondary source, simply enough, is just everything else, right? There are plenty of things that can tell us about the past that weren't necessarily there when it happened. A great example of a secondary source is anything like textbooks, right? So understand the difference between something like a journal written by a person who was there and a textbook that was written by an author who was not there. A textbook would be considered secondary. All of your teachers, right? We're old, but we're not that old. We're not there in 1492, but you can still learn a lot of information about them. Anything that you find mostly on the internet, right? Other primary sources can include things like, artwork, paintings. Again, if they were there in that time and place, that is why they're considered primary. So, understand that difference, primary and secondary, and also understand. And this is just to kind of expand on this point. Just because something is primary, it doesn't mean that it is more useful or more accurate, right? It's not that primary sources are better or more factual, and secondary sources are worse and less factual. No, that's not the difference. The difference is between, was it there when it happened or wasn't it, right? So our textbook gives us an example of a primary source. That is the Hagia Sophia a church that was built in the Byzantine Empire in the city of Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire was a Greek and Christian empire. And so by analyzing the Hagia Sophia, we can see some of those elements, right? The Greek and Roman architecture, specifically the dome structure here. We have some iconography, some icons of Greek Christianity. I think I want to say that these are mosaics. But in 1543, the Byzantine Empire and the city of Constantinople was conquered by the Islamic Empire of the Ottomans. And when the Ottomans took over Constantinople, they renamed it to Istanbul and updated the Hagia Sophia to reflect that Muslim culture. So, for example, following the conquest, we now see things like uh, Islamic iconography that now outfits the Hagia Sophia and these towers that were constructed. This is part of Islamic architecture. And so, whether we're looking at the domes or the mosaics or the calligraphy or the other types of architecture there, all of these things would be considered primary sources, right? They were there at the moment when we're interested about historical inquiry, right? Your textbook also provides us a really, really good outline. And this gets back to something we mentioned in the first section, and that is the practicing of these analytical skills that really help us be better critical thinkers. And that is when a historian comes into contact with something like a primary source, we shouldn't just take it at face value, right? If we read it, oh, it must be true, let's write it in the history books. No, we go through a whole process of asking a bunch of follow up questions to better understand what these sources tell us about the past. As historians, that is the fundamental question for us. What happened? So here are some great guiding questions that need to be addressed before we can get to the point of writing down the history. So, for example, in terms of the author, what is the author's background? What motivated the author to produce the source? Do we know the author? And once we know the author, if they were rich, if they were poor, if they were Christian, if they were Muslim, does that have any impact on the source being created? Same thing with the audience. For whom was it written? Was it meant to be public or private? I think we kind of understand this on sort of a basic level, right? We don't communicate with our friends maybe the same way we communicate with our teachers and professors. Who was this person writing for? And what can that tell us more about the source? Intent, why was the document written? Was the intent to be factual? And was it meant to persuade someone, right? Why did they write this, or why was this source created? And then lastly, the context. What was happening when the individual wrote the document? Was there any sort of intimidation? Was there any sort of distress? What circumstances surrounded the source that was being created? And only after we have addressed all of these questions can we then gain a better understanding of these sources, these pieces of evidence, and how they fit into the larger picture of world history. Now, your textbook mentions at the end here kind of an interesting proposition, what they call to quote hidden in history, and that is, what if there are no sources or sources are hard to obtain? Right? It kind of goes along with that, with that saying. See if I can mess this up. If a tree falls in the woods and nobody is around to hear it, does it make a sound? And if we apply that to history, if there is a civilization or event or person that existed in the past, but we have no sources, right? We have no evidence of that event or culture or language or civilization existing. Did it exist? And we could see how this can be a problem for historians because we want to uncover that. So we might just say about hidden in history, this is in some sense, the effort by historians to, in some sense, capture history where sources are difficult to obtain. And it doesn't just have to be about like a lost civilization like Atlantis or something like that. It could be even within a society. So, for example, we find that in certain civilizations at certain time periods, we have plenty of sources for the elite or wealthy classes of society, but it's hard or difficult to obtain sources for everyday people. So, there's this constant exercise of trying to capture the history where some of these sources are harder to come by. Section 3, causation and interpretation in history. So, one of the questions that historians are fundamentally interested in is the question of, in some sense, history is a retelling of what happened, but why did those things happen? And in answering that question, why, we are often looking at the cause of certain events. But causation can be a little bit more nuanced and complicated. Our textbook provides us with kind of different layers of causation that help us to better understand certain historical events. Um, we break them up into primary, secondary, and tertiary causes to certain events. A primary cause, if we want to go ahead and just define this would be the most immediate cause. So, what happened maybe in the most sort of near term to motivate a particular event or to, for us to get to the bottom of one of these why questions. We're first presented with a contemporary example that is, why am I watching this video? So to answer that question, why you're watching this video, the primary cause, the most immediate cause might be, well, the professor assigned it and the material will appear on the test. I want to do good on the test, so that's why I'm watching it. But that's not the only reason why you're watching it. You also, hopefully, want to do well in school so that you can be successful. Well, what's behind that? Well, society tells me an education will help me realize my full potential. So, whether you're watching this video to do well in the test, to do well in school, or because society values doing well in school, these are all essentially correct answers to the same question. It just kind of depends on the perspective that you take, right? So it's not that one is right and one is wrong. They're all essentially correct answers. And in regards to certain historical events, when we ask these why questions, why did these things happen? Oftentimes it does take a little bit more of a nuanced and in-depth explanation as to why things happen. So we have two examples here. One is causation for US entry in World War II. Why did the United States enter World War II in 1941? Well, the primary cause was that on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. A secondary cause was that President Roosevelt had already been actively working to help Britain fend off a potential German invasion, Germany at the time being an ally of Japan. So there's already kind of a background causation going on. And if we go one layer further, if we look at the, I don't know, 100, well, not quite 100 years, well, 90-year history between Japan and the United States. Japan and the United States were in competition for control of the Pacific, and that had been going on for a much longer time. So all of these being correct answers to the question of why did the United States join World War II? Another causation, I guess you call it causation pyramid here, for Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople. Mehmed II was ruler of the Ottoman Empire. Constantinople, we mentioned in the earlier section, that was the city of the Hagia Sophia, and then outfitted with Islamic calligraphy and some updates to the architecture. So, primary reason, Mehmed II wanted to make a statement and achieve what no other sultan, a sultan is an Islamic ruler, had been able to achieve. Secondary cause, Constantinople was a great prize, not just a city that lay at the heart of East West trade. Its conquest would send a clear message. And lastly, the tertiary, the Ottoman Empire had been expanding since its founding. Conquest served to bring new wealth and new people into the empire. So, all correct explanations for why Ahmed II conquered Constantinople in 1503. Now, the last part of this section goes from causation to interpretation, and that is, how we kind of the different lenses or different approaches or different structures that we take to history. You can imagine that dealing with many, many, many different sources, we need some way of organizing them. We need some sort of framework. Maybe one way of imagining it is that, these sources are, I don't know, think about like maybe like a bunch of kids' toys, right? They're kind of all over the place and they're different and they're here and they're there. We need some way of organizing it, right? We need to create certain bins so that we can put certain sources in to kind of make it so that we can better understand the bigger picture. And that's kind of a little bit about what interpretation is, right? Kind of the structure that we use in order to understand the sources. And throughout time, historians have changed the way that we interpret history, right? We've changed the bins, so to speak, that we organize all of the sources in. Your textbook does mention this in an earlier section, and so it might be worth mentioning here, and that is something that we call historiography. Historiography. And historiography is, in some sense, kind of the history of history. So if we went back to the year 1950 and looked at a world history book, and then today in 2025 and looked at a world history book, even though what happened hasn't changed, we might have new sources, which is nice. Our approach has changed. And we can kind of trace the different types of approaches throughout various decades. One approach to history is known as the great man theory. And this is a focus on the actions of individual people, right? And really, in the earlier years, I would say, there was a lot of emphasis on this great man approach. People like Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, who we will talk about in this textbook earlier, Mehmed II, that history is fundamentally about these very influential individuals, and it's what they do and it's their actions that really kind of push history forward. This was also coupled with an approach to history sometimes referred to as progressive history. And this essentially is the idea that history moves forward. Um, Maybe a more clear way of putting that is that things are kind of constantly getting better. Right. So this was a way of telling history to say, look, in the past, things weren't good, but then this happened, this technological innovation, this political revolution, this idea, and pretty much history is a story of things were bad in the past and they're good now. And so we've kind of progressed through history in this way. Again, more popular, I would say, in the past. It's been contested a lot more recently. Other approaches include intellectual history. This would say that ideas are the most important, right? So not so much looking at the people or events as they happen, but really looking at the ideas behind them, right? Kind of more of a philosophical approach to history. Then there's social history, which, in the 1960s, 1970s, social history began to gain a lot more in terms of popularity. Social history, in some ways, stands in contrast with the great man approach. This is the history of all, or maybe we might say, everyday people. So historians began to ask questions of, well, not just what were the kings and rulers and sultans and emperors doing, But what was kind of the average everyday person doing at the time? And so there began to be more of an emphasis on the masses of people rather than just specific people or specific events or specific laws. Also in the 1960s, 1970s, and really onwards, people have been revisiting these historical narratives and revising them. This effort to revise the historical narrative by adding new perspectives is called revisionism. We might just say to update the historical narrative by adding new perspectives. And part of this revisionist process is to get at some of the historical record or account that is more difficult to obtain. We talked in the previous section about what is quote unquote hidden in history. And that is when we are dealing with sources about specific historical events, some sources are easier to come by than others. And there's also kind of another saying that goes along with these efforts to revise the historical narrative. And this is another saying that some of you may have heard of before, and that is, history is written by the winners. And so, is there a way that we can look back at our history textbooks, right? The ones that have been published, and to say, look, I think we're missing a certain perspective here. And so, what the revisionists want to do is they want to kind of get at those aspects of the historical record that have been neglected in the past. So, for example, those that take a Marxist approach, the Marxist historian fundamentally looks at the division between rich versus poor. And that is to say, look, many of the sources and much of the history that we've already accumulated up until this point is skewed far more towards those that are rich and powerful. Is there a way that we can get at the history of those that are not quite as represented? Same thing with those that take a revisionist approach for women's or gender history. This is the division between men versus women. And that is to say that most of the historical accounts have been created by men. Is there a way that we can get at a more accurate depiction for everyone who lived at the time, specifically women, those who are underrepresented? And lastly, the post colonial approach, which looks at the division between the imperial powers, right? The conquering, rich, colonizing nations versus the colonies. And the same thing, most of the history has been created by the imperial powers. Is there a way for the post colonial historian, people like Chinua Achebe, for example, to get a more accurate depiction of history by representing the former colonies?